Hello and welcome to another episode here on Viking.TV with me, Anne Diamond. This week I want to talk food and the most amazing place in the world. The oldest food in the world is reckoned to be cheese, but it may not be the sort of cheese that you and I recognise. I want to talk about the history of cheese and maybe what you drink when you eat it. Where better to discuss this than here at the oldest pub in the world, in this absolutely gorgeous village in England called 40 Green. And I'm here at this very, very old pub. As I say, it's reckoned to be the oldest in the world, the Royal Standard of England. So let's go meet some cheese experts, maybe people who can talk to us about wine or ale with cheese, how cheese has evolved over the centuries, why we still love it, and what its future holds. Matthew.
Hi.
Hello. Oh, it's lovely to be here. You're
Lovely
the
day.
landlord of this amazing place.
Yes, the landlord of the oldest free house.
Well, I called it the oldest pub in the world,
Yes,
is it?
It's the oldest free house, which has never been owned by a brewery, so it's always been privately owned.
really?
So that's how my predecessors have called the pub.
But it is really old. How old
It
is
is very old. Oh, it's so well now. The sign used to say 900 years, but now it's 1,000 years in parts. So it's
And
just,
it's always been owned by families.
yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
isn't that wonderful?
That's right. Yeah.
You're in a long, long line of history then.
Well, yeah, and that also, that's what you think about when you take over your little section of time.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, you're just the caretaker
That's
of it
right,
for
yeah.
a very short period of history. And you wonder what sort of people have been here and come for their ale or whatever it was they drank 900 odd years ago.
Well, mostly beer.
Mostly beer,
Yeah, mostly
okay.
beer. Modern days wine.
Yeah.
Yes, it started out as say a little Anglo-Saxon cottage, and the alewife, who's normally the woman who brews the beer, they would have probably brewed good beer, so the neighbours would come to her for the beer, and that's how
That you start a business.
That's how the start of
Yes,
business
that's
starts
right.
the pub. So they would go to her parlour, and then they'd barter. So someone else would make the shoes, somebody else would make the cheese. And
But you know, standing here today on a gorgeous sunny day, it's not just about the inside, which we'll go and see in a minute, which is amazing, but it's about making it hospitable and a lovely place to sit under the trees and in the sunshine. And
yes, well, yeah,
that must take so much work.
yes, trees are better than umbrellas.
Oh, they
Because
are.
they're there forever.
Yes.
Again, you try to do things that enhance the pub, and also that you're leaving a legacy for the next guy.
This bit we're just about to go into says King Charles Room. Is
Yes.
this the oldest part of the building?
This originally was the barn to the pub.
Oh.
The barn was a Tudor barn, and they would have kept horses because the pub acted as an inn, and it was like a Green Lanes inn. Just less than a mile away, you've got the London to Oxford Road.
Yes.
And there are toll roads on the road.
Which was a very important road through history.
So for all the coach drivers, they would go down the straight road. For the backs, these were green lanes. So if you were selling your cattle, geese, sheep to market into the London markets, you'd have to come through the green lanes. And of
So
course,
do we think King Charles ever stopped over for
that's what they say. It was.
Really?
There's a room there without any stairs in at the moment, but they take them out when they converted the barn. But in those days, they would just sleep on the floor.
He might have stayed overnight even.
Yeah, that's.
I love it.
Between his mistresses from.
Yes, I'm sure he had plenty to call
Tawny
on
Court, yes.
along the A40.
Lady Castlemaine, I think was it. So
Let's go in. Let's go and see
Yes.
what you've done inside because it is so atmospheric. I love the way it says "Welcome Pilgrim" over the door.
Welcome Pilgrim. Well,
Yeah.
everyone's
Welcome, but if you're as tall as you've got to be careful.
everyone's a pilgrim.
Yeah. Oh, you see.
So,
What an incredible atmosphere there is already the minute you walk in.
Would it-
Amazing up there. You've got what looks like Pirates of the Caribbean.
And
That's a door into the room that you were telling
yes,
us about.
that's how you got in. There used to be an open staircase, or they'd just have a ladder.
Or a ladder. And gradually I can see that, people have added to it all through the years. But you've got a bit of absolutely everything. And I've been here in the winter when that stunning fireplace over there has been ablaze, and it is the most brilliant place
Yes.
to sit and talk and eat. And you do food. And we'll talk about food in a
Yes.
minute, but you're very well known for a wonderful menu as well as
Grandmother's cooking.
Grandmother's cooking, is that right?
Basically, don't reinvent the wheel. It's comfort food and what you'd expect from a British pub, rather than sort of
but it's beautiful.
pseudo Mediterranean menus.
You were telling me that your predecessor had some sort of an antiques business,
Yes,
which is why we might see so many things.
That's right. Yeah, there's old postcards, old pictures, and you can see some of the items they've moved. They've travelled from one room to another, but they're still here.
Yeah. Let's go up towards the bar, because interestingly, and we're going to be talking a lot about food and the fact that you are very well known for lovely food, but it just makes you wonder how things have changed over the years. I mean, look at your beautiful menu: duck terrine, locally shot game pie.
Yes, the farmer. See, we still get our food from the farmer.
Yeah.
One of our customers fishes as well, so we get chalk stream trout. Hey, bartering, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
You see,
Roe deer, venison.
Yeah.
Sausage and mash, very
That's
good.
right.
Those beautiful meals, how different would it have been 1,000 years ago when people would have come in here just for something to eat and drink?
It won't be so much protein, I guess. It's 1,000 years ago, it would have been, I say, if we're going to talk about cheese, that's the time.
So is cheese one of the oldest foods in the world?
Yeah, I think certainly it was for Britain. We have a history of sheep and wool making, because in the House of Lords, the Lord Chancellor sits on the wool sack.
The wool sack, that's it.
So that's showing the wealth of Britain in the Middle Ages, and of course you're going to get your cheese from there. The monks would take the cream off. The bishop. They take the cream off.
So posh people would take the cream off.
Yes, and then you're left with a product that will make a very hard cheese. So there's your hard protein.
I don't think of sheep cheese as being hard. But because the cream's been taken
That's
off,
right.
the rest goes pretty...
Yes, so you've lost the sort of the richness.
Yeah.
So it's just hard.
So the peasants
protein.
would have eaten...
Hard cheese.
Hard cheese.
Hard cheese,
now,
as the saying.
Clearly they wouldn't have, as we sophisticates like to think of ourselves nowadays, they wouldn't have had a glass of wine with that. What would they have had?
It would have been beer. Just like today, it's not safe to drink the water. So
we have a problem.
I'm a landlord, drink beer.
Yeah.
So in the beer making process, you're boiling the water. So beer was safe to drink. So everybody drank beer.
But it was still alcoholic, even if it was fairly mild.
There were mostly it would have been what we call your small beer, which again you make the strong beer for the toffs, the rich, and then you can also do a second brewing.
So the rich would have had stronger beer and creamier cheese.
Yes.
And the poor chaps would have had hard cheese.
Hard cheese.
Would it have been a bit
and
tasteless
small
as
beer.
well? And small beer.
Well, it fed
them.
Yeah. So yes. So you can imagine that's, unless you're a small hamlet where you're not being interfered with by the church, the state. So therefore they'll probably eat better and eat well, eat their produce.
It's incredible to look at this place now and think that just what you're describing happened here.
Yeah.
On these flagstones, probably. I mean, somewhere that. I'll tell you what. I want you to meet now two people that very kindly you've allowed us to bring and meet you, and they are experts. They go around the world talking about cheese and wine, the pairing of the two. And whilst they know, like you, about the history of cheese, they're looking forward to the way cheese is going to evolve over the next few hundred years. Should we go and meet them?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, here I am in another nook in this wonderful old ale house, the oldest pub in the world, we think. And it's gorgeous, isn't it? It's an absolutely beautiful place. But here I am now meeting the experts that I was telling you about. They're experts about cheese particularly, but also in the pairing of cheese and wine or whatever else you might want to eat or drink with cheese. And I have to tell you, the smell coming from the table is, I just wish you could smell it too, because it's wonderful. But here we have Bronwen and Francis Percival, who are said experts. A warm welcome. Isn't this a fabulous place?
It's an amazing place. Yeah. Thanks so much for having us.
Well, absolutely. And since we're talking about particularly cheese, it being such an old food, and you particularly are so interested in the way it's going to evolve evolve over the next few years, it seemed a good place to talk about cheese. Right, so how did you two meet, first of all? Are you both into cheese, or I understand you're a bit more into wine?
Where Bronwen is a cheese professional, I am the food editor of a wine magazine, The World of
You're
Fine
the
Wine.
food editor of a wine
magazine. So I sort of straddle the two worlds. But we met on our first date. I thoroughly mansplained cheddar to poor Bronwen.
Which is silly, because she will have known everything about cheddar, won't she?
Yes, but I think that doesn't really stop the inclination to mansplain.
But you're the technical director of something that a lot of people know, very famous, the Neal's Yard
Dairy.
Dairy, yeah. So she knows her stuff already.
I think I was young and naive back then.
He did get a second date, so he was charming in all the other
I paid
ways.
the bill,
So yes,
To make up for it with your sheer charm. Actually, can you explain to those who don't know? Neal's Yard is very, very famous in Britain. Is it famous all over the world? Will our American audience, for instance, know about Neal's Yard?
I'm not sure. There is an international presence of some of the other companies that started in Neal's Yard in Covent Garden back in the late 70s, sort of Neal's Yard Remedies for one,
yes.
Which, they've been separate companies for decades now. But Neal's Yard Dairy started in Covent Garden as a dairy, really making yogurt, soft cheeses and so forth at this little outpost in the middle of the city. Yeah. And it quite quickly, I think, evolved into something much more interesting, which was capitalizing on the fact that there were these cheesemakers working at farms around Britain and Ireland who were being told by big supermarkets, there's no use for your inconsistent, difficult to handle, craggy cheeses with loads of flavor. What we want is something cheap and consistent and easy to put down a cutting line. But actually, customers in London were really keen when they had the opportunity to taste these cheeses to get just that.
Well, that's what you say. I've noticed in the back bit of the book, which I haven't read yet because you can see it's pristine. But in the last, we've had cheese forever, and we've already been talking here about how cheese goes back, well, hundreds and hundreds of years. But what's happened to it in the last 100 years is very significant, particularly to you two.
Absolutely, and I think what we've seen over the last 100 years is the effect of all of those commercial pressures on cheesemakers and on milk producers to try to increase volume and decrease price and increase convenience for huge supply chains and networks that are really designed to deliver, this consistent cheap product. And in the process of delivering that extraordinarily efficiently and well, we've lost a lot at the same time.
And lost a lot of the flavour as well.
Exactly.
So on this first date, I'm more interested now in the first date. Is that what you talked about, cheese?
We talked about cheese. We actually met at the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery, which is a sort of a relatively well-known sort of food studies conference. And Bronwen was presenting essentially her master's thesis on tradition and EU food law in the context of cheese.
What a subject!
I know.
Yes, we still got married, and so I think I came and sat next to her on the bus back to London, and she was
we've got a lot to
rolling
talk about.
rolling her
talked
eyes.
my ear off, but the rest is history.
Now, of course, we've all noticed now that you have an American accent.
Yes.
Do you come from the cheese state?
Well, I come from one of the 3 cheese states. My family is from California, and my uncle actually had a huge dairy farm producing liquid commodity milk in the high desert of California. And so coming from a dairying family, I think I certainly never expected to work within the dairy industry, but actually maybe there was a seed that was planted there. I've always loved food, and then having the opportunity to kind of approach it from this different angle and see the diversity of all these small producers, many of them working on their own small farms, farming those animals and answering sort of similar questions about production, but in a completely different way.
Yeah.
And I think the history of Bronwen's family as dairy farmers is the history of dairy farming, particularly in the US, across the 20th century. They always followed all of the advice they were given. They were the size that you were meant to be.
Yeah.
They expanded across each generation. They moved from selling directly to consumers to selling it just as a pure commodity. And I think that was very interesting for us in terms of understanding how we got here.
Yes.
And then trying to think about how these things that are completely unlike this, these cheeses that we've got here, where they retain the identity of the producer. Milk is great. You put it in a huge tank with everyone else's milk and it all disappears.
Yeah.
You've got a really pure commodity. Whereas these cheeses are difficult. They're awkward. They're difficult to work with. They change every day, every batch. And I think a lot of Bronwen's professional life, when she's making selections on the farm, where she'll go and taste every batch of production and decide which ones do we want to buy, is about managing that variability.
Well, that must be variable from everything, to the animal itself that produces the milk, to the family whose tradition it is to turn that into cheese, to the microbes or something that you talk about a lot in the book, that different recipes for making the finished product. And the finished product, I presume, isn't always the same.
Absolutely not. And on one level, that's part of the beauty of it, that you never get bored tasting these cheeses,
No,
because
that's right.
you go back the next week and you get something,
And they
hopefully,
look slightly different.
they
or
look
taste
slightly different, they
different.
taste slightly different. Hopefully, they all taste different in a good way. And that's, I think, where my job comes in, is to help it when things aren't necessarily tasting different in a good way.
Yeah, the best way to make a passionate argument for all of this is to taste it. So, Bronwen, what do we do? How do we taste cheese properly? And please, can we get stuck in?
Absolutely, let's do it. So, I think the first cheese that we can taste here is the Kirkham's Lancashire. Now, this is a very classic British cheese from the north of England, and it's made on a small farm with raw milk. And one of the things that I think is so special about this cheese is that it really transmits the flavor of that raw milk to the taster.
Thank you.
So here you go.
Name it again?
Kirkham's Lancashire.
Mrs. Kirkham's.
Yes, Mrs.
Well,
Kirkham's.
Ruth
Although now
Ruth
it's
is pretty much
She-
retired.
her
She
son
retired,
Graham
but
who's
she-
at the helm.
She's the one who started it, maybe.
She is, yes. And taught by her mother-in-law, and with a tradition stretching back hundreds of years, this is a cheese that really is quintessential
It is
British
beautiful.
style.
What do you think? It's beautiful,
It's
isn't it?
buttery.
Yeah.
Rub it at the top of the
It's
palate.
buttery and crumbly, which is
Yeah.
nice. I want to know what sort of biscuit or bread or whatever to eat it with.
I think something quite plain. The thing that makes this cheese so special is that real sort of subtle complexity and length of flavor. So anything that gets in the way of that, I think, is a bit of a shame.
I think this was a cheese you struggled with when you initially started 17 years ago.
I'm so sorry. What made you struggle?
Well, as a newly minted cheesemonger, I naturally gravitated towards the gooey, really more smelly, more in-your-face, bombastic cheeses.
Whereas this is not that.
It's not.
No,
It's the
very
opposite.
gentle.
And I think that many people who work with cheese go through a sort of similar evolution, where we start out looking for, like, show me some power.
Yeah.
And actually, at the end of the day, the cheeses that have the most pleasure and joy and room for...
Show us something gooey
Yeah.
and smelly then.
All right.
Before we start to talk about pairing it with something to drink, one more cheese.
All right, let's look at this one here. This is a camembert cheese.
Yeah.
Again, another really classic style that, every person who walks into a cheese shop will know already what a camembert is and what it should taste like. And I think one of the things that makes
Thank you.
this an interesting cheese, particularly from the perspective of our book, is that this is a cheese with a rind that would not exist in nature.
You see, I ate the rind.
Absolutely, absolutely.
This
This is
You've eaten the whole lot in one go. Gosh.
There's more where that came from.
It was bite-sized.
So you can eat the rind of a camembert. It's perfectly acceptable.
Basically, any cheese.
People aren't
with
going
a-
to tut at you. No.
No.
They might tut at you if you don't eat the rind.
Yeah, well, I've seen people cut the middle out.
And
don't
just
you?
have the
just
middle.
eat the middle. And what about baking it as well? Is that...
Absolutely.
Okay.
Why not? If you enjoy it.
Okay, so that is so beautiful. I automatically find myself reaching for a glass of wine to have with that.
There we go. Now, the interesting
That
thing
doesn't usually
about
happen at
these white-rinded cheeses is I think they are some of the most challenging wine pairing cheeses you can get. And a lot of that is to do with the behaviour of that rind.
nice.
So if Bronwen can cut you another slice, but this time cut off the rind in this case.
What is this wine? Matthew, you...
A Chenin Blanc.
Oh, very nice. It's nice, isn't it? He's waiting for some more cheese, by the way.
Oh, sorry. I'll get right on that.
Cheese, grommet.
So yes, this is
So
one of the
you think that
experiments.
the whole experience is going to be different if you cut off the rind?
Yes.
Yes.
So we want you to taste the core of the cheese with the wine, and then
Okay.
just the rind with the wine.
And then just the right... Oh, right.
Yeah.
What a terrible job. Okay.
Thank you.
That's very nice.
Hopefully, it's quite
Yeah.
buttery, quite round.
Very buttery.
And particularly when there is a secondary fermentation that many wines go through the malolactic fermentation, where hard, appley malic acid is converted into lactic acid, and that can often produce a lot of these sorts of buttery flavours.
Yeah.
And if it sees some oak as well.
Because you don't know the science is happening when you're just tasting, do you?
Well, the amazing thing about malolactic fermentation is they only discovered it in the 1950s. And previously, they just knew some barrels had behaved properly and some barrels hadn't. And it was this arbitrary, fickle god striking them down in the cellar.
Yeah, that's a different taste. Oh, it's very different, actually.
Yeah.
And perhaps a little bit more challenging. Sometimes we think of these rinds
that is.
as real wine fighters.
That's much more of an acquired taste, almost, isn't it?
It brings out all sorts of sort of barnyardy flavors and kind of volatile.
Are you getting a barnyardy flavour?
Yeah.
Okay,
And
introduce us.
clear.
I mean, those, we were talking earlier, Matthew, weren't we, about how, 1,000 years ago...
Hard cheese.
It would have been sheep's cheese that would have been the staple, and the rich people creamed off the best, and so the poorer people got hard sheep's cheese to eat, real peasant stuff.
Well, I think the key thing there, particularly where we're still slightly within the sort of the gravitational pull of London, is butter. Because the clever thing you do if you're a dairy maid is you double dip. So you skim off your cream, and you make that into butter, which is like your cash crop. It's not just something that there's a lot of demand for. It's something that'll get you the money pretty much immediately as soon as you've made it.
Yeah.
Then you're left with this sort of skim milk, which you can make. And when you were talking about that sort of hard, somewhat unforgiving cheese, this is particularly famous in East Anglia. And there was a type of cheese called Suffolk Bang, which was basically the noise you'd make if you dropped this sort of very rubbery, very, very hard cheese. And it actually found this great niche as sort of the cheese equivalent of ship's biscuits.
I see.
It was what you packed off if you were going to sail to Australia in a sailing vessel, because no one was going to sort of eat all of it in one sitting.
It would keep you going for a long time.
For a very, very
I
long
want us
time.
to try one of those. Are they goat's cheeses? You said the little, because they look powerful.
Could you pass me that?
They look
please?
as though they're small but powerful.
Absolutely. And here I think is a really good example of the natural microbes in milk at work with ripening. So what you can see here is a completely natural, uninoculated rind, and the molds that are growing on the surface, you can see they're sort of a patchwork of different species, and this is lending interest to the cheese. It's not like this very pristine white rind.
Could you eat the rind of that?
Of course you can.
Because it looks
And
a bit
the interesting thing is
dangerous, doesn't it?
when you read accounts of Camembert in the 1890s, they're talking about rinds that are much, much more like this.
that.
So this is a
That's been
facet
cleaned
of
up.
Pasteur
20th
Institute
century.
scientists coming in the 1890s and trying to find something that will give you something that's essentially more shelf stable, that has a longer window that you can eat it
Okay,
in.
show us how to taste this one
So
then.
for this, I just go ahead and take it in half. And one of the things that we can see here is how right underneath this rind, the molds are sending their little roots down into the cheese, and they're digesting it, and in the process of digesting those fats and proteins, they're releasing lots of aromatic compounds that will hopefully help this cheese taste really strong and wonderful. There you go.
No, I don't eat the rind of this one.
You can? Yeah, absolutely.
Look at the colour. I don't know whether I can. Well, I'll give it a go.
Thank you.
Although I think a lot of the colour, are they
that's
using
tasty.
charcoal?
That's tasty.
They are,
On
but
this. Yeah. So a lot of the
That's
colour,
got-
the colour that we're seeing here, the sort of the darker colour, is they actually ash.
That's beautiful.
No, there's it's incredible how you can take milk and using the power of these microbial communities, that many of which are there naturally, you're bringing out all of these distinct and different and interesting flavors.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating. Some of the cheeses you've brought, that one, for instance, has got the most incredible colour inside.
Yes. No, and this is
And that's what the microbials are doing to the...
So this
cheese
yellow
compound.
color is a function of the fact that it's early summer now. The cows have gone out into the fields, and actually one of the pigments that's in grass is beta carotene, which is orange. And that goes straight through the cow into its bloodstream, into the milk, and it's
that's
very
what gives the cheese
fat-soluble.
its colour.
And that's why you can see with some cheeses in the wintertime, when they're not eating when they're eating either hay or dried grass that's been preserved,
fascinating.
the color gets lighter.
The colour of that one, isn't that
But
wonderful? And you can see the action going on
Yes,
from the outside
in.
rind.
We have here essentially an 18th century food fraud, because that depth of yellow colour was how you could see, oh, the milk is so rich and so great.
Don't tell me they added colour.
Absolutely,
Absolutely.
and they still do. It's the traditional thing to do. We've got a Cheshire cheese here.
And that's had added colour.
Absolutely.
Oh.
And so,
What colour should it be? What, creamy white?
I mean, it would probably naturally be something along these lines, if not a little bit lighter, because it's because of the way that this curved structure refracts the
So
light.
we are still being conned a little bit.
I would say it's one of those things that started out as a fraud and ultimately has become a tradition.
That's a very clever way of getting around fraud.
The interesting thing is if we think about the US cheddar market, where it has all become flipped, where cheddar by default is sort of quite a garish, orange, reddy colour, because everything has had this dye added. And so the premium cheese is a white cheddar.
Because that's...
And that's just the same thing that just hasn't had the dye
That's
added.
interesting about American cheeses, because I think when we go to America, we wonder, everything seems to have Monterey Jack or something on it, doesn't it? Which is, again, a very brightly coloured cheese. And I have arguments with one of my sons over this. If you're cooking a burger at home, he says a burger needs that sort of almost plasticky cheese on the top. And just putting good cheese on the top, it doesn't taste so good. What do you think?
I think this is a perfect example of how quality is a function of an aesthetic that's entirely about what the intention of the producer is. Personally, if I'm going to have that sort of juicy burger, I do want that slice of Kraft single on there. It gives you a very
That's
particular.
weird.
It gives you a different texture. That's the point, probably. Rather than
Yes,
taking
it's
away
gluey
from the
almost,
burger,
isn't
yeah,
it?
it's just texture rather than taste.
Would I sit down at and have something like that on a cheese board? Absolutely not. But I think everything in its proper
In its place, yeah.
You know,
But
can have an aesthetic.
the appropriately chosen cheese here, it's like that Gabine would melt beautifully as well as any.
But that's where it's important not to be a snob about these things. Just have what you like the taste of.
Yeah, and maybe one week you have one, and the
Now,
next
we
week
were
you have the
talking
other.
earlier, weren't we, Matthew, about how in the olden days they would have been eating their cheese, but they wouldn't have been drinking wine with it. They would have been drinking some sort of ale. And I know you've got various different sorts of ale.
Yeah, well, I
there.
thought that goat's cheese would take a Chiltern Pale Ale. I think, and Bronwen was saying that beer is a good...
Beer is good with that sort of
Okay,
goat's cheese
good pairing.
because it's a strong taste.
Yeah, because where the wine reacted to the other one.
I think the interesting thing with beer is you're operating at much higher pHs. It's a much lower acid beverage, and so your the interactions are a lot more sympathetic. You've also got that element of carbonation, which with particularly sort of unctuous mouth coating.
Natural.
Do you like it?
Well, this is more bitter.
It's an acquired taste.
It's
Yes,
a
it
bitter.
is
You're,
quite
yes,
bitter.
this is a bitter.
But that's why you think it would go well with that sort of cheese.
because that had a big mouthful and far more than
Do you
that.
like ale?
I do.
Well, have a go.
All right, here.
See what you think.
Cheers. See, I do like that.
Do you?
Yeah.
I like the glasses.
There
They're
you go.
particularly Royal Standard glasses. What other sort of ale have you got, and what cheese would go with it?
Well, this
All right. I mean, let's see. I think let's
stout. I have a stout.
Stout. Should we try that
And,
with the blue cheese?
I don't even know what a stout is.
A stout, like Guinness.
Oh, like Guinness.
Everyone knows
Okay.
Guinness.
Yeah.
It's like coffee. The barley, the malty barley, has been roasted longer. So
what would you pair cheese-wise with a stout?
Maybe the Stilton.
Or even the Kirkham's Lancashire. It's one of the interesting things. Often in the northwest, you see Lancashire paired with these things like an Eccles cake. Classically, so something that can deliver you some of those sort of brown
Let's have a go at the
sugary
blue then.
sets of
I think a lot of people are
sets
scared of blue
flavours.
cheese, aren't they?
Well, I think the key with the blue cheese is that you don't have too much blue. The blue should be an accent rather than the main event, because blue in excess can really be a little bit too powerful.
And how runny should you let the cheese get?
That is a personal
personal thing.
question. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I think many cheeses, when they get too old, they just sort of get muddy and indistinct tasting. And for me, a cheese is at its best when it's powerful
I like it to be a
and
bit
fully
runny.
fledged,
That's beautiful
but
too.
not over the top.
Again, what's this one called?
This is actually Stitchelton, and it is a raw
It's not
milk.
a Stilton.
It's not a Stilton.
It's a Stittleton.
Stitchelton.
Stitchelton.
So made in the same area as a Stilton, but and to a similar method, but made using raw milk rather
Yeah.
than pasteurized.
Oh, right. Raw milk.
So Stitchelton is the medieval name of the village of Stilton. So
Oh,
I
I
think
see.
when they launched this, there was some discussion about whether it should be called
I can't-
Méthode Stiltonoise, or I can't believe it's not Stilton.
And that would go well with a stout.
I think so.
I've never tasted a stout in my life, but I'll give it a go with the right cheese. Wow, the smell is strong. Just
It's so like syrupy and sort of it smells dark.
yes, it does. Yeah, I always wonder with these things. It's the same with cheese. Is it the smell that's getting to you first, or is it the taste?
I think
And would it be different if you held your nose?
It entirely.
immensely different. And I think, some cheeses really you can smell them a mile off, like some of these with
Yeah.
very volatile microbes on their rinds, and then other ones are really all about the taste. But the disjunction between those two can sometimes be quite puzzling. You can get the strongest smelling cheese in the world that's actually quite mild, or vice versa.
Do you get many cheese snobs here, Matthew? I mean, are there people who have a distinct idea of the sort of cheese they want, the sort of wine they want with it?
We do toasted cheese. So that's where. So there's, if you like, there's
Do you mean cheese on toast?
Welsh rabbit,
Yeah.
cheese on toast.
Yeah.
Cheese
What's
on
the best
toast.
cheese than that?
Well, we like cheddar. But
So just out of curiosity, in a really kind of very old-fashioned pub like this, you don't have a sort of cheese board or something
I
with
I have done a cheese board, but I think our puddings are better. So how much can you eat? So we decided that we once had a big cheese board spread, but you're fighting then traditional puddings.
Well, but if you were sitting down to a very big meal,
Yeah.
a banquet even, what is the last course? Cheese or pudding?
Most people would take it like, well, they're finished with cheese because then they'll drink more. Ha ha ha.
Yes,
Good
that's
for
true.
me.
Yes.
So then you'll throw cheese at the end.
Francis, what would you say as a food editor?
I think it very much is that sort of French versus British tradition, that the French would have it before, and then you have dessert. I think the idea of those things like Welsh rarebit, that idea of the sort of the savoury, that's so a British thing that you might have your dessert, your cheese, and then a savoury just to help you finish that sort of third bottle
and
of
to
port.
polish off the bottle. Yes.
Is an interesting one. I think something that we have been very interested in examining is actually the American tradition of cheese as hors d'oeuvre, of flipping it around and serving cheese at the beginning of a meal.
At the beginning of a meal.
Absolutely. When your guests arrive, you put out the cheese board, and people can chat, and maybe you open a bottle of champagne while you eat the cheeses.
Just to get the taste buds going before sitting down to the actual meal.
I think a cheesemonger would always wish that you served it like that, because of these problems of sort of everyone being full.
Well, that's right. I wouldn't want to eat very
have
much
it
after
at
that.
the-
It's interesting you mentioned the French as well there, because we've been discussing quite a lot recently here in England about sort of wars between France and England over cheese, over what is the most popular cheese in Europe, for instance, at the moment. Is it camembert? Is it cheddar? Is it something else? There's a bit of a sort of...
I think globally the most popular cheese is skim milk mozzarella, because you put it on a pizza and melt it, and there are many people particularly in California who made a lot of money out
that's
of
the popularity of the pizza.
producing.
more than
Exactly,
anything.
and it really does reflect it's a completely sort of different market. I think the thing that always annoys us is people will say, "Oh, the UK has more different types of cheese than the France."
And is that true?
Well, I think the difference is, in France, they might not have so many different named brands of cheese, individual people making a cheese that they're calling something completely different than any other cheese. But if you look at the scale of the industry and how many farmhouse producers of cheese there are in France and how much cheese people in France are eating and buying, that is a completely different order of magnitude. In fact, the French cheese reblochon, it's just a little,
Reblochon.
it looks a little bit like this, made in Savoie. There is twice as much PDO reblochon made every single year as there is all of the artisan cheese in the UK. of that one style
I don't
of
think
cheese.
I've ever tasted a reblochon. I'm ashamed to say I have to look it up. Before I say thank you and goodbye, because we've got to stop eating and drinking somewhere, can you cut into that one? Because I'm dying to see what it looks like a slightly deflated pillow.
Yes, and I think you'll see why when we cut it open. Are you ready for
What is it?
This is a cheese called Yarlington.
Yarlington.
It's made in Gloucestershire, and it's sort of modeled after a reblochon. And you can see one of the reasons why this style of cheese is so popular is it's because it's a texture play. It's a very mild, milky cheese, but it's really got that sort of shiny paste, a little bit oozy.
A little bit oozy, exactly. Yeah.
Would you like to try it?
Yes, it looks absolutely fabulous.
I think this is a style of cheese where, in terms of something where there is a tension between how it smells and how it tastes, this really pushes that, because these can really be quite...
Thank you.
It can be quite farmyardy.
Quite farmyardy on the nose, and then they're...
Delicate,
Beautiful.
milky.
It's very delicate, very creamy, absolutely beautiful. So, on reflection, talking through the book as we have and tasting through everything, cheese has clearly got a future. But is it going to be supermarket cheese, or is the artisan market going to flourish over the next 100 years or so?
Oh, that is a really big question, and I think one of the things that we really wanted to zero in on in the book was this idea that just being a small-scale producer might not be enough to make you make something that's different and interesting enough to be worth that extra price.
So in actual fact, it's up to people like Matthew to do as you're doing now, to interest people in different sorts of cheeses, local produce, something that's unique.
And to talk about the flavors that you can really only get when you're farming in an interesting way and using that raw milk and the microbial load of that milk to make something that even if you did exactly the same thing on the farm next door, it would taste different.
And that is lovely. And that's something worth celebrating, isn't it? So, I mean, your book is called Reinventing the Wheel. By Bronwen and Francis Percival. And but you're talking particularly about milk microbes and the fight for real cheese. So what is real cheese as you see it?
To us, real cheese is the product of a complete and interesting farming system, which is made in a way that allows the taster to really taste the cumulative impact of all of those interesting and laudable farming systems.
But doesn't that suggest that what we go into our supermarket and buy isn't real cheese?
I think that does, and that is a distinction. I think we were working inspired somewhat by CAMRA, the Campaign for Real Ale, by Patrick Rance,
who's an author,
of a previous generation who wrote sort of the 1970s, early 80s sort of classic works on.
So you've co-authored this book, but you must have known when you wrote it that it would actually irritate a lot of people who already think they're the king and queen of cheese.
Completely, and I think one of the reasons that made us sit down and start fighting out how we were going to actually put this down on paper was that it was getting increasingly frustrating, to see the cheesemakers working at a tiny scale, not cutting any corners, doing things with absolute integrity, and to see the products of their work get sent out into the world and mixed in with cheeses that were way cheaper, way more convenient, way less sort of interesting, but without the rewards that come from people recognizing and appreciating that, they're not long for this world.
But you do seminars, don't you, where those people must come and listen to what you say. What's their reaction?
I mean, I think, unfortunately, with our seminars, we may be preaching to the choir. That there's an element of these seminars are designed to pop the hood on food and help people understand how, what we're talking about is not just romantic mood music about people having their own cows or anything like this, but like how do these microbes in these cheeses, in the raw milk, actually work to generate flavor, and how inadvertently, in the quest to make raw milk that's cleaner and cleaner, have we actually potentially wiped out the microbial communities that are giving these cheeses their interest and their flavor.
I think that it's also a product of a very specific moment within the biological sciences as well, where suddenly in the last 25 years, microbiologists have the technology to be able to examine collections of microbes as communities rather than just relying on culturing out individual bugs.
Right. So we have this much more sophisticated science, and for me, the kicker, the thing that's so amazing is that only now is science getting smart enough to show us how the things that were done by our great-grandparents who didn't even know what a microbe was were actually quite
Yeah, but a lot of people
sophisticated.
won't be interested in the science. They'll either be at the consumer end of things, and the only thing they'll be interested in is the taste and the price. And the other people are commercially making cheese and making a lot of money anyway. So, I mean, who are you trying to influence with this book? And are you having an effect?
Well, I think ultimately you don't have to understand the DNA or the technology of the science to understand that actually cheeses that are made in this way taste fundamentally different and more interesting in a way that I hope that somebody who comes and just has a taste can think to themselves, I get this, even if the details are beyond or not really of interest to me. That's completely fine. But I do think that the world is changing around the dairy industry, and we are having conversations within the world at large about whether people should be eating dairy products and what good dairy farming looks like and how that needs to work in concert with the environment. And I think ultimately that changing ecosystem of the world has the capacity to really reward people who are working in this way.
The most interesting thing about the most interesting cheeses, we have in our heads this idea that cheese is the product of these sorts of lush, very rich meadows and all of these sorts of things. Whereas, actually, if it's super fertile, then you're probably actually going to grow a crop that you can feed directly to humans there.
Yeah.
And the pastoral agriculture, animal agriculture is something you do on the margins. You do where you can't do anything else. In the UK, you do it up that sort of western, sort of facing the Atlantic Gulf Stream where it's all too wet. If you're in continental Europe, you're probably doing it up a mountain.
Fascinating. So it has an impact, and it comes from the very landscape.
Exactly, and you're reconnecting that. But what you're also doing is, if you say, okay, so that we can remain within planetary limits, we need to have a smaller dairy industry. The question becomes, where is it legitimate to have it?
Okay, now this is interesting because our audience are what Viking love to call curious travellers. And where the countries they go to, and even on board the ships, they have the chance to do wine and cheese tastings. Would you recommend that? To excite the palate, to get this sort of argument
I think it
going?
is tremendously good. I think the biggest problem for sort of cheese tastings is if you're going up the west coast of the Irish Sea in the UK, then yes, the cheeses are quite sort of maritime in their inclination. Cheddar is fascinating because cheddar, the whole style of cheddar was developed as this transatlantic conversation between the eastern United States and the west of the UK. It's all about what can you put on a 19th century sailing boat. The problem is if you're going around France, the really interesting bits of France, you need to get into them inland a bit before you really hit the interesting cheese
But
country.
if you're going all over the world in various parts, it's just interesting to try.
Always, yeah.
Wherever you are, trying the interesting thing that can only be made there, you can't lose.
Well, all I can say is I've got 3 glasses in front of me. You've got none, but shall we just say cheers?
Cheers.
And here's to the next 100 years of cheese.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Cheers.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you for watching another episode here on Viking TV with me, Anne Diamond, and a lot of very interesting cheese. We might be hours yet at this table. So for the moment, goodbye.